Deputy Cairns.
Yeah, just like I said, we will be kind of working like that to keep it shorter, because as we acknowledge there's a lot of amendments gone in and there's no point in us doubling up on everything that we say. But I suppose just to come in at this early stage and in relation to these specific amendments, I think they just speak to an issue that's at the heart of the bill, and it's the type of information adopted people and their relatives are entitled to. And like Deputy Pringle said, it's necessary to explicitly include in clear and comprehensive definitions things like administrative records, other records, and sources that will guarantee survivors and relatives access to full information. They should be provided with. The level of detail that we're looking for is based on the experience of survivors and campaigners. For years, people have been denied access to information based on public bodies and officials' interpretation of the law. So I think we can all understand why people feel the urge to make explicitly clear things like this in the legislation. There can't be any ambiguity this time. State bodies, institutions and the church need to have no room to continue to deny people access to their information. And I just want to come at this early stage to just say that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. So yes, look, I'll thanks deputies for their amendments, and I'll address them. So my understanding of the intention of Amendment 1 combined with Amendment 90 is to include administrative records in the definition of relevant records, so that such records can be safeguarded. And look, this is something we've given significant consideration to. I know it was a reference within the pre-legislative report as well. So I suppose it's first of all really important to mention that the legislation essentially provides that all birth, all early life and care information which a relevant body holds must be provided to an applicant. So this will include any such information held on any form of administrative record, and that's why we've written all these definitions so broadly. The term relevant record, that doesn't limit the release of information under parts 2, 3 or 4 of the bill. The term relevant record is about the safeguarding of records, and that's dealt with in part 7 of the bill. And that definition of relevant record, it already covers any administrative record containing birth, early life, care or medical information, or information such as admissions and discharge registers, visitors' books, baptismal and confirmation records, and any other records containing personal information on the daily life of individuals. So already that definition of relevant records is very wide. But importantly, Section 43 of the bill empowers the Minister to prescribe other classes of records as relevant records and bring them within the scope of the definition. So we're of the view that the definition of relevant record is already extremely broad and covers everything that we need to. But we do have that option under Section 43 that we can come back to this in the future. A future minister can come back to this in the future as well. So we have that flexibility if something is left out of the definition of relevant records. Now, obviously, administrative records, they're very useful in understanding the overall working of institutions, mother and baby institutions or county homes institutions. They have a historical value. So that's why Section 43 empowers the minister to prescribe relevant records, and it's envisaged that these administrative records would most certainly fall within the definition that's set out in that section. So I'm satisfied that the legislation would support the inclusion of administrative records in a way that allows coherent archives of institutional records to be protected. But look, what I will say is, I hear there's some concern about that issue of administrative records. I'll ask my officials to consider if there is any additional detail that could be included within the definition of relevant record that might provide some further reassurance in this regard.
Amendment 1 then, if you believe that it's already kind of catered for within the existing legislation, is there any harm in including the amendment?
In replication, having it referenced twice, I don't see the benefit of it.
But it's not there is no replication, like that. Those words are not in the legislation at the moment. And if you're saying that you think that it's just already catered for under other language, what harm in specifying it if we just accept that first amendment in relation to that grouping, to clarify?
I suppose my understanding is if legislation addresses an issue, to put in another piece that addresses the same issue just because it's no harm. I don't think that's how we draft. I suppose many people have raised the issue of kind of the complexity of the legislation in this area. If we're double referencing certain areas, I think that only adds to that.
Can I go back? Sorry, Deputy Funchal. If that's the end of the discussion there, how stands the amendment number 1?
Push.
Yeah, press it.
Those in favour?
Oh.
Those against? I think that the question is lost. The Cairns, if you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I suppose it's important that the bill recognises the illegality surrounding the adoption of birth registrations of very many people. Currently, the bill focuses on incorrect registrations. This may seem an accurate term for some cases, but for many others, it is not accurate at all, and moreover, it's deeply insulting to people considered. Without acknowledging the illegalities involved, there's an erasure of the realities and lived experiences of many adopted people. Minister, you previously expressed a willingness to address this issue. I'd ask for your specific response to Amendments 72 and 75 in my name, which allow for the terms incorrect and illegal to feature. Is this approach the one that you'd be willing to accept? I think we all want to address this issue in a way that is legislatively sound while recognising the lived experience of adopted people and their relatives. In reference to, I heard you on the Europolitics podcast, and you were asked why we wouldn't include that terminology, and you said that you have a willingness to include both incorrect or illegal. So I'm just wondering if you've looked into that since.
Similar, do we propose them now, or do we?
If they were part of that group or further questions, we have two. That's what I.
That like unique grouping situation.
Right there first, and 104, 105, 138, 139, 3.
Myself and Deputy Patrick have a very similar amendments in this grouping. Do we propose them now, or do we?
If they were part of that grouping,
yeah.
That list, what I'd like to do, and I'm open to feedback from the committee, but what I'd like to do is, we have a long list here of all the grouping, and to introduce them all and to get them all spoken to. And then if there are further questions, we can speak to them. Further input, we speak to it, and then we'll get you to respond. Now again, that's how I want to do it. If people feel that there might be a slightly more streamlined way to do it, because it is a bit confusing when we have 2 to 5 inclusive, 70, 76 inclusive, 81 to 83 inclusive, 104, 105, 138, 139, 352 and 359. So I appreciate it might get, there's a huge bulk here. So certainly this is the approach, that's over the other side of the page. But this is my plan of attack on these amendments. So again, I'm open to feedback here, but certainly that's what I'd like to just, if there is anyone with an amendment, let us get it out there first, and then we can have a input and then a response from the Minister. So.
It's my first time going through this process of this part of a committee, and with all the amendments and that like unique grouping situation. Just to say that I might come in and ask questions throughout, because there is loads of amendments in one group, and I'd be worried that I'm going to miss something, and I might just have to keep asking for clarification on things.
Please do. I'm constantly asking for clarification of the clerk here as well.
Thank you.
So feel free to ask. I don't think I think it's been a while since there's been a bill this big and amendments this big. So
can I ask then, when we're deciding on an amendment, whether they're pressed or passed or voted, will you go through each number individually?
Each numbered one will be done individually. So we had done Amendment 1 and discussed with it 78, 84, etc. So when we get round to 78, we will vote on it separately. It won't be just, oh, well, we already did that, if that makes sense.
So despite the fact that we're discussing, for example,
my amendment
there, number 72 that I just spoke to, we won't be speaking
on it again, but we will be voting on it separately to Amendment 2.
But we won't be voting on it today, despite speaking to it today?
No. Right. Unless we get that far down the list.
Right. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah. Now, we're...
Our concern is if we use a definition of illegal birth registration, there is a requirement to prove illegality before you can use that particular provision to benefit. So remember, someone who is the subject of an incorrect birth registration as it currently stands can use this legislation. If you have to not prove that your birth registration was incorrect, but it was actually illegal, that is a harder standard to prove. That means that provision of using this legislation can apply to fewer people. And what we've always tried to do is broaden up access to this legislation to let as many people people as possible use the provisions of this legislation so they can get their information. But I am cognizant of the issues that have been raised and the language that have been raised there. So I brought forward an amendment quite similar to Deputy Batchick, and I'd asked my officials to work with the Office of the Parliamentary Counsel, and this amendment clarifies that information leading to an incorrect birth registration was given to the General Register's office by a third party, and that information was not merely incorrect but also false or misleading. So we've used that term, using the addition of that language that as a result of giving information that was false or misleading, the name to look to try and address that. And that's very similar to the change that Deputy Batchick has proposed. And I feel that this addresses the concerns that have been raised.
Yeah, just because obviously we won't get to discuss this again when we're voting on that amendment, and I have to say I will be pushing number 72 to a vote, Minister, at that time, because I completely understand what you're saying there. Nobody wants to limit it to anybody having to prove anything. So you reference somebody having to prove that their adoption was illegal. Amendment 72 that I have in is to insert or illegal birth information. It's just literally incorrect to say that they're just inaccurate. What's the original term in the legislation now? Incorrect. It's incorrect to say they're just incorrect registrations. Some of them are illegal, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. So I'm not saying to replace it. The amendment is to say or illegal birth registration information. So I understand your sentiment of not wanting to limit it, but the argument doesn't make any sense because you can include the two. So it's not limited to, but it acknowledges the fact, that is what people are looking for, that there was illegal birth registrations. That is the purpose of the amendment.
Any other contributions?
Just very briefly, just to say,
Yeah.
I agree with the point that Deputy Cairns is making. I think because it gives the option of, or because I do actually understand where you're coming from on this, and we had those discussions ourselves during our PLS stage, but I do think the option that's there, it's the significance of it for people who do feel very aggrieved, to have lived, nearly your whole life potentially and find out that you're not who you thought you were. I mean, it is like distressing, I think, is an understatement. So I do think that it's well worded. That's all, thanks.
Okay, so again, we've had everyone move their motions. We've had a response from the motions. So I'll ask, does the Minister want to respond to any of that discussion?
Thanks very much, Chair. Well, look, I've listened to the concerns that have been raised in this area. I've brought forward an amendment similar to one that was brought forward by Deputy Batchick, which I believe addresses this issue. I believe it recognises the diversity of situations that led to registration, led to incorrect registrations, some of which were because of inaccuracies and some of which were because of the provision of false or misleading information. And I think that is now, through the amendments that I'm proposing, this legislation will recognise that fact, and I think that addresses the issue that's brought about here. And I think this is the best way forward in terms of addressing this concern that has been raised by deputies and by groups.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. So again, just to recap, so we've introduced them all. We have a discussion from the committee, response from the Minister, and so we'll move to a vote. So Section 2, Amendment 2, in the names of deputies Funchion, Ward, Cairns, Murphy, Boyd, Barrett, Smith and Kenny. How stands the amendment? Is it withdrawn? How stands? Pressed. Those in favour say tall.
Talk.
Those against say kneel. I believe the question is lost. Okay.